Vanessa Hale was already laughing when she stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor. She wasn't hiding it anymore. Not today. She walked straight into the private lounge of the Ashford Tower, set her coffee on the marble counter, and checked her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking downtown Chicago. Behind her, the city gleamed like something she was about to own. Today was the day Claire Bennett would finally disappear from the picture. Quietly, legally, permanently. Damien had told Vanessa the divorce hearing was a formality. Claire was 8 months pregnant, exhausted, emotionally hollowed out. She would sign, she would take the settlement and go. And Vanessa would be waiting at the finish line. She picked up her phone and texted Damien, "I'll be watching. Make it clean." She had no idea that across the city, in the penthouse she had already mentally redecorated, Claire Bennett had already made her move. And that move would change everything. If this story hit you somewhere real, drop a like and comment the name of the city where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because what happens next is something none of them saw coming. So, pregnant wife left the court forever. Then her letter destroyed the billionaire. The morning of the divorce hearing started the way most catastrophic mornings do. Ordinary on the surface, wrong underneath. Damien Ashford's alarm went off at 6:15, same as always. He silenced it before the second tone, swung his legs off the bed, and sat for a moment in the gray Chicago morning light, his hands loose between his knees. The penthouse was quiet. That particular kind of quiet he had stopped noticing years ago. The kind that told you the person who used to fill the rooms had slowly stopped filling them. He told himself he felt nothing about today. He had been telling himself that for weeks. He showered, dressed in the charcoal suit his assistant had selected, and poured coffee from the machine in the kitchen. Claire's mug, the white one with the chipped handle she'd refused to throw away, was in the drying rack next to the sink. He didn't look at it directly. He looked past it the way you look past something that has no relevance to the day's agenda. By 7:20, he was ready. The hearing was at 9. His legal team would meet him in the lobby at 8. There was nothing left to do but wait for Claire to come down from the bedroom. He called up from the base of the stairs. "Claire, we need to leave by 8. Nothing. He assumed she was slow this morning. She was 8 months pregnant, and mornings had been hard on her for months. He knew that in the distant, logistical way he knew most things about her now. He gave it 5 minutes, poured the rest of his coffee down the drain, and climbed the stairs himself. The bedroom door was open. The bed was made. Not in the way a housekeeper makes a bed. It was made the way someone makes a bed when they want to leave things tidy. The pillows were straightened. The duvet was pulled smooth. On the nightstand, her phone lay face up with the screen dark. Next to it, her wallet. The old tan leather one she'd had since before they met. And beside that, laid flat on the wood, her wedding ring. Damien stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. He walked to the nightstand and picked up the ring. It was warm from sitting in the heated room. He set it back down. He opened the closet. Some of her clothes were gone. Not everything. Not a dramatic emptying out, not a ransacked shelf. But enough. The practical things. The things you would pack if you planned to be gone for a while. He went back downstairs. He checked the kitchen, the living room, the study she sometimes used in the mornings. He checked the guest bathroom. He stepped out onto the terrace and looked down at the street 42 floors below, where the city was already moving in its usual purposeful way, taxis and pedestrians, and the distant sound of a bus. She was not in the penthouse. He called her cell. The phone on the nightstand buzzed faintly through the ceiling above him. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, his jaw set, his mind doing the thing it did when a situation failed to compute, running through explanations rapidly, sorting them by probability, looking for the one that made sense. She'd gone for a walk. She'd gone to see her friend Marla, who lived 4 blocks over. She'd had some kind of medical event, and someone had helped her downstairs. He called the building's front desk. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford. Did my wife leave this morning? What time?" A pause. He heard keys on a keyboard. "Mrs. Ashford came through the lobby at approximately 5:40 this morning, sir. She had one bag. She took a cab." "Did she say anything to the doorman?" She said, "Good morning." That's another pause. That's all he noted. Damien hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment longer. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney, Preston Hale. No relation to Vanessa, just a coincidence that had always faintly amused him. "Claire's gone," he said when Preston picked up. "Gone where?" "I don't know yet. She left before 6. She left her phone and her ring." Silence on the other end. When Preston spoke again, his voice had shifted into the careful register of a man who understood that the day had just become substantially more complicated. "Damien, if she doesn't appear in court today, I know what it means. The judge is going to I know what the judge is going to do, Preston. Call the clerk, tell them we need a continuance, cite a medical situation, buy us time." He paused. "I'll handle the rest." He ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the penthouse for a long time, looking at nothing. The courtroom on the 14th floor of the Daily Center had the stale, climate-controlled air of every municipal building in Chicago. A smell like old carpet and coffee and whatever particular brand of resignation accumulates in rooms where people come to formalize the things that have already fallen apart. Preston had managed to push the hearing to 10. By 9:40, the gallery was murmuring. Word travels fast in the circles Damien moved in. His legal battles had never been private. The business press covered his company's every significant move, and a divorce hearing involving the Ashford name had drawn a few carefully planted media observers who sat in the gallery with the professionally neutral expressions of people paid to watch other people suffer. There were also a handful of Damien's associates, people whose presence this morning he had neither requested nor would be able to explain later. And there was Vanessa Hale. She was seated in the third row in a gray blazer, her posture excellent, her face composed into an expression of polite curiosity. She had absolutely no legal reason to be there, but she was there, and she knew he could see her, and the slight angle of her chin told him she thought this was already over. Damien sat at the plaintiff's table and stared straight ahead. At 10 past 10, the judge, a compact woman named Hargrove with close-cropped hair and the expression of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible human disaster, looked at the empty chair across the courtroom and then at Preston. "Mr. Hale, where's Mrs. Ashford?" Preston cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we're still attempting to reach Mrs. Ashford. We believe there may be a medical concern related to her pregnancy. Is she hospitalized?" "We're not certain of her precise location at this time, Your Honor." Judge Hargrove looked at the opposing counsel, a sharp-faced woman named Diane Cross, who had been Claire's attorney for the past 4 months. Diane Cross sat very still with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and on her face was an expression that Damien couldn't quite read. Not surprise, not concern, something more like the expression of someone who has been told a secret and is keeping it well. "Ms. Cross," the judge said, "does your client's absence have anything to do with your case strategy?" "Your Honor," Diane said, "I have not been in contact with my client since late last week. I have no information regarding her current whereabouts." That was said very carefully. Damien heard the careful construction of it. "I have not been in contact with my client since late last week," which told him exactly nothing about whether Diane Cross had known this was coming. The gallery was buzzing now. Damien heard pieces of it. The words "missing" and "pregnant" and "billionaire" drifting through the rows like something already hardening into a story. Judge Hargrove continued the hearing for 30 days and issued a welfare check order. As Damien rose from the table, he met Vanessa's eyes across the gallery. Her expression had changed. The small triumph was gone. In its place was something more cautious, a reassessment, a recalibration. He didn't wait to speak to her. He walked out of the courtroom with Preston at his shoulder, and the cameras that had gathered in the hallway exploded. By 6 o'clock that evening, it was the story. Not the divorce, the disappearance. Pregnant wife of Chicago billionaire Damien Ashford vanishes hours before divorce hearing. The phrase "vanishes" was doing considerable work in most of the headlines, which leaned heavily on words like mystery and fear for safety, and billionaire's empire rocked. There was a photograph that someone had pulled from a social media account. Claire at a charity event 8 months earlier, visibly pregnant, standing slightly apart from a group of people and looking at something off camera with an expression that the caption called "haunted." Damien's communications director called 3 times. He didn't pick up. He sat in the study of the penthouse with a glass of scotch. He wasn't drinking, and his phone on the desk, and the door closed. He had already spoken to Chicago PD. They had been professional and thorough and very slightly careful with him in the way police are careful with people who have both money and motive. They had taken her phone, her wallet, her wedding ring into evidence. They had confirmed the cab, a rideshare actually, traced to an account in a name he didn't recognize. The account had been created 3 weeks ago. The pickup location was a corner 6 blocks from the building, meaning she had walked there in the November cold at 5:30 in the morning, 8 months pregnant, with 1 bag, and been very deliberate about it. That last part was the thing he kept returning to, the deliberateness of it. The weeks of planning that had existed inside the apartment alongside him without his knowing. He picked up the glass, put it down. He thought about the last real conversation they'd had. Not the logistics, not the schedule coordination, not the flat negotiations about who would handle what in the split. A real conversation. He could not in full honesty identify when it had occurred. His phone buzzed. Vanessa. He looked at her name on the screen for a moment and then declined the call. He wasn't ready for her version of this. The reassurance that Claire had probably just panicked, the suggestion that this changed nothing, the barely submerged satisfaction that his wife had done something that could be characterized as unstable. He didn't want to hear it, not tonight. He opened his laptop instead and pulled up the file his private security team maintained on the penthouse's access logs, visitor records, and his wife's known associates. He had compiled it months ago. Not as surveillance, he had told himself, but as preparation. Knowing the territory. The same way he approached every negotiation. Understand the other side's assets and liabilities before anyone sits down. Now he looked at it differently. He looked at the name Claire had visited most frequently in the past 6 months. Marla Chen, a landscape architect who lived on the north side. He had never liked Marla Chen, though he had never articulated why. She had a way of looking at him at dinner parties, a quiet, assessing look, that he found faintly irritating. He made a note to have his investigator, Ray Kowalski, start with Marla. Ray Kowalski had been doing private investigation work in Chicago for 22 years and had never worked a case for anyone as controlled as Damien Ashford. Most clients, when they hired him, were in some stage of panic. They arrived at his office or called him at odd hours with their voices tight, telling him too much, telling him things he didn't need to know, and asking questions that were really just fear dressed up as questions. Damien Ashford called him the morning after the hearing at 7:30, described the situation in 4 minutes, and told him what he wanted in 2. Find her, Damien said, and be quiet about it. Ray spent the first 2 days working the obvious angles. Marla Chen said she hadn't spoken to Claire in 2 weeks, which was possible and also the precise kind of thing that was easy to say and hard to disprove quickly. He checked hospitals in the metropolitan area, then the surrounding counties. Nothing. He pulled the rideshare records from the account in the false name, which had been opened with a prepaid card, and traced it to a drop-off at a Greyhound station on Harrison Street. The Greyhound station was the first thing that genuinely surprised him. It was a deliberate choice. Cash purchases couldn't be traced the way credit cards could, and bus routes spanned the country without the kind of federal documentation that air travel required. Whoever had helped Claire plan this had known what they were doing, or Claire herself had known. Both possibilities were interesting. He told Damien about the bus station. There was a silence on the line. She planned this. Looks that way. For how long? Based on the prepaid card purchase. At least 3 weeks, maybe longer. Another silence. Ray had learned to read the quality of Damien Ashford's silences. This one wasn't grief. It was the particular silence of a man who had just recalibrated what he was dealing with. Find the route she took, Damien said, whatever it costs. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. Damien came home to the penthouse at 11 at night after a day. He had spent half in meetings, he barely tracked, and half on the phone with Ray, and he found an envelope on the kitchen counter. The building's front desk confirmed it had been delivered by courier at 3 in the afternoon. A service based in Boston, the sender listed as a law firm he didn't recognize. The envelope was addressed in handwriting he knew. He He stood at the kitchen counter and held the envelope for a long time. He was aware, in some corner of his mind, that he was afraid to open it. That was new. Damien Ashford was not a man who experienced fear in any clean, identifiable way. He experienced risk assessments and mitigation strategies, and the occasional adrenaline of a deal that could go either direction. But standing in his kitchen at 11 at night with his wife's handwriting on an envelope, he felt something that had no strategic name. He opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten in the clear and deliberate script she'd always had, the kind of handwriting that suggested a person who took time with things, who believed that how something was written mattered. Damien, I've been trying to write this for 6 months. I'm not going to apologize for that. Some things take as long as they take. I want you to know that I'm safe. The baby is safe. I'm not writing this to ask for anything from you. I'm writing it because I think you deserve to understand why I left, even if understanding it won't change anything for you. I left because I couldn't let our son be born into the life we were building. Not the money. The money was never the point. I'm talking about the air inside that apartment. I'm talking about what it feels like to live in a house where every decision is really a negotiation, and every conversation is really a position. I'm talking about what it taught me about myself to watch you look through me for 4 years and tell myself it was because you were busy, or because you were stressed, or because successful men are just like that. I stopped believing those excuses somewhere around month 7 of the pregnancy. I don't know if I started believing them in the first place or just worked very hard at it. I'm not angry at you. That surprises me too. I thought I'd be angrier, but I think what I actually feel is something closer to sad. Sad for you specifically, because I think you built something enormous, and somewhere inside of it, you misplaced the parts of yourself that made you worth knowing. I don't know if you can find them again. I hope you can, but I'm not able to wait around to find out, and my son is not going to be a casualty of the looking. Don't look for us. I know you will anyway. I know you can't not. Control is not a choice you make. It's just how you breathe. But I want you to know that when you find us, I will not be coming back. Not for any amount of money, not for any legal maneuver, not for anything your attorneys can arrange. This isn't a negotiating position. This is just what's true. I hope one day you understand the difference. Claire Damien read the letter once. Then he set it on the counter and walked to the window and stood looking out at Chicago for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Ray Kowalski. "Find her faster," he said. "I don't care what it costs." The media coverage had settled into 2 distinct camps by the end of the first week. One camp focused on the concern angle, the welfare of a visibly pregnant woman, the unanswered questions, the appropriate gravity of a situation involving potential medical risk. These outlets were cautious and relatively fair. They used phrases like "questions remain" and "whereabouts unknown." The other camp had decided what the story was and was busy telling it. In this version, Claire's disappearance was not a mystery. It was an indictment. The word fled appeared constantly. Photographs of Damien going into and out of buildings, his office tower, the police department, a restaurant where he'd had a working lunch, were captioned with language that implied movement, evasion, something to hide. A former employee of Ashford Capital, identified only as a source, told a business news outlet that Damien was ruthless and calculating in his personal life the same way he is in business. That quote ran everywhere. His communications director finally reached him by appearing in his office in person, because he had stopped answering her calls. Her name was Sandra Park, and she had worked for Damien for 6 years, and she was one of the very few people in his professional life who spoke to him the way a normal person speaks to another normal person. She closed the door behind her, stood across the desk from him, and said, "You need to make a statement." "No." "Damien, anything I say becomes part of the story. Anything you don't say is already part of the story. You're the villain in 40 news cycles, and you haven't said a word." She dropped a folder of printed articles on his desk. "Read those, because the version of you that exists right now in the public mind is someone who either drove his pregnant wife away or did something significantly worse, and until you put your face on camera and say something human, that's the only version people have." Damien looked at the folder but didn't open it. "She's fine. She left voluntarily. The police know that. The public doesn't know that. I don't care about the public. Your investors do. Your board does. You have a shareholder meeting in 3 weeks, and I have 2 board members who have already called my office to... She stopped, took a breath. I'm not asking you to perform grief. I'm asking you to say you love her, and you want her to be safe, and you're cooperating with authorities. 3 sentences, that's all. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Chicago was doing its usual thing: traffic, the elevated train, the indifferent city going about its afternoon. Draft it, he said finally. I'll look at it. Sandra nodded once and left. She did not say thank you, because Sandra had excellent judgment about when gratitude would read as condescension. Plus, the statement ran the next morning. It was exactly 3 sentences. He loved his wife. He wanted her safe. He was cooperating fully with Chicago PD. Sandra had removed his name from the 4th sentence, which had started, I have never, and had been heading somewhere defensive. She was right to remove it. It didn't stop the story. Nothing was going to stop the story. But it shifted the temperature slightly, and that was what Sandra had actually been after. What it did not address, and what no statement could address, was the thing that was now happening inside Ashford Capital itself. The disappearance, the coverage, the divorce proceedings, and now a whisper campaign that Damien was distracted, that the company was rudderless during the search, that certain deals that should have closed were sitting in limbo because the CEO was spending his afternoons on the phone with a private investigator instead of managing the $4.2 billion in assets under his direct oversight. Some of it was true. He knew that and set his jaw and worked harder in the hours he gave to the company, and gave fewer hours to sleeping, and more to Ray, and more to staring at Claire's letter, which he had read 7 times now and still didn't quite know what to do with. She was not wrong. He kept arriving at that conclusion and then pulling away from it because there was a considerable difference between a thing being true and a thing being actionable. Yes, he had treated their life together as a negotiation. Yes, he had treated their apartment as a managed environment. Yes, he had looked at his own wife and registered her primarily as a variable, something to be accounted for in the broader structure of his days, not a person he was still choosing to be in relationship with. The letter said, you built something enormous, and somewhere inside of it, you misplaced the parts of yourself that made you worth knowing. He hated that sentence. He hated it specifically because it landed somewhere real, and he did not have an immediate argument against it. On the 9th day, Ray Kowalski called at 8 in the morning. I've got something on the bus route, he said. She took a Greyhound to Detroit. From Detroit, she took another bus to Cleveland. After Cleveland, I lose the trail for a couple of days, but I pulled traffic camera footage near the Cleveland station. She checked into a motel on the east side of the city under the same false name from the rideshare account. Single room. She was alone. How do you know she didn't keep going? I don't yet, but the motel clerk remembers her, said she stayed 4 days, said she... Ray paused. Said she seemed calm, like she knew exactly where she was going. Damien was quiet. I'll find her, Ray said. I just want you to know it might take a few more weeks. She's careful. She's very careful, Damien agreed. He ended the call and went to his desk and looked at the list of things he was supposed to accomplish before noon. Board update memo, call with the Tokyo office, review of the Q3 restructuring proposal. He looked at the list and felt nothing in particular about any of it. He pulled up Ashford Capital's organizational chart on his laptop and looked at the entry that said Claire Bennett Ashford, co-founder, strategic advisor, 12% equity stake. It had been a mostly ceremonial role for the past 2 years. She attended the annual meeting, received briefings, had a title on the letterhead, but the equity was real. 12% of Ashford Capital was not a rounding error. In the divorce proceedings, his legal team had been working carefully to argue that her contributions over the past 4 years did not justify the full 12%, that it had been a gift rather than earned equity, that her departure from active involvement preceded the company's most significant period of growth. He closed the organizational chart. He thought about the letter again. This isn't a negotiating position. This is just what's true. He was not sure he knew the difference between those two things. That was a strange thing to realize about yourself at 44, having built a $4 billion enterprise on the ability to read what was a position and what was real. That when it came to the woman who had left him, he genuinely could not tell. Vanessa Hale came to see him on the 12th day. He didn't invite her. He didn't discourage her either, which was its own kind of answer. She arrived at the penthouse at 7 in the evening with a bag of food from a restaurant she knew he liked, and the expression of someone who had thought very carefully about what expression to wear. She set the food on the kitchen island and looked at the apartment, at the notable tidiness of it, the absence of a second person's accumulated daily life, and said, "How are you doing?" "Fine," he said. "Damien." "I'm fine, Vanessa. Thank you for the food." She looked at him for a moment. Vanessa Hale was not a stupid woman. She had never been stupid, which was part of why he had been drawn to her, and also part of why he was, tonight, sitting across from her in his quiet kitchen and feeling something that was not quite comfort and not quite its opposite. "The police say she left voluntarily," Vanessa said. "She did." "Then—" She tilted her head slightly. "Then what are we still doing? She's gone. She chose to go. The hearing gets rescheduled, your attorneys proceed with the divorce in absentia if she won't appear, and in 6 months this is over." "She took something," he said. Vanessa waited. "She took the narrative, the public narrative." He set his glass down. "Every story out there right now says I drove her away, that she ran. You understand what that does to the company," Vanessa said, and her voice had a flatness in it. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that all it is? The company?" He looked at her. He said nothing. "Because if that's all it is," Vanessa said carefully, "then yes, your attorneys handle it, the media moves on eventually, and you come out the other side. But if it's something else," she stopped. "I need to know what I'm working with here." It was an honest question. He gave her the courtesy of a real answer. "I don't know," he said. That was not what she had come hoping to hear. She was professional about it. She kept her face neutral. She finished her glass of wine. She said something about a work call she had early in the morning. When she left, he stood at the window and watched the city and tried to figure out whether what he had said was true. He thought it probably was. That was the most unsettling part of the 12th day. Not the police questions, not the board memos, not Ray's incremental updates on Claire's trail through the Midwest. It was standing in the kitchen alone after Vanessa left and realizing that the question, "Is that all it is?" didn't have the answer he would have expected. And outside, the city moved on without him, indifferent and enormous, full of lives he knew nothing about, and people who had never heard of Damien Ashford and were not likely to care. He went to bed at 1 in the morning with the city lights visible through the glass and Claire's letter on the nightstand and the ring she had left sitting in its usual place. And he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling, and what he thought about, unexpectedly, unhelpfully, was a Saturday in the second year of their marriage when they had driven up to Lake Geneva without any particular plan and walked along the water for 2 hours in the cold. And she had talked about a book she was reading, and he had half listened and half thought about a deal he was working, and she had stopped at one point and looked at him and said, "You know, you don't have to solve anything right now. We're just walking." He hadn't known what to do with that. He had laughed a little, said something like force of habit, and she had looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that he had filed at the time under the category of affectionate exasperation, and then they had kept walking. He understood now what that look had actually been. He rolled onto his side and looked at the ring on the nightstand. He had 12 years of that look, filed under the wrong category. The city hummed outside the glass. Somewhere Claire Bennett was sleeping in a room he couldn't picture, and her son, their son, was not yet in the world but was coming, was already on his way, was already a person with a life Damien had no vision of. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time. He didn't sleep that night, not really. He drifted in and out of something that felt more like a long, exhausting negotiation with consciousness than actual rest, surfacing every hour or so to stare at the ceiling, then pulling back under into half-formed images that weren't quite dreams. Claire at the window, Claire at the sink. Claire at that charity event in the photograph the media kept running, standing slightly apart from everyone, looking at something he couldn't see. He was up at 5:15. Made coffee. Stood at the kitchen counter in the dark of a November morning and drank it without tasting it. The city below was beginning its slow ignition. First the delivery trucks and the early commuters, then by 6 o'clock, the fuller hum of a city coming back to life. He watched it from the window and thought about the fact that somewhere out there, in a room he had no picture of, his wife had woken up this morning and made her own coffee and looked out at a different city or a different view and felt apparently free. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He pulled out his phone and called Ray Kowalski at 7, which was 40 minutes before Ray typically started his day. Ray answered on the third ring, sounding unsurprised. "She was in Cleveland for 4 days," Damien said. "Then what?" "I'm still working the next leg," Ray said. "I've got a contact at a regional bus company, pulling manifests. Give me today." "You have today." "Damien, I want to say something." "Then say it." A pause. Ray had a particular quality of silence that Damien had come to recognize as the man deciding whether something was his business. "You've been calling me every morning before 7. That's fine. But I want you to understand that more pressure from you doesn't make me find her faster. It just means I spend time managing your expectations instead of working the trail." It was a blunt thing to say to someone paying him as generously as Damien was. Damien respected it for exactly that reason. "Understood," he said, and hung up. He went to his desk and opened the restructuring proposal he had been avoiding for 3 days. He forced himself to read it. He made 2 pages of notes. He sent a memo to his CFO. He performed, with great deliberateness, the work of a man who was in control of his professional life. But even as he did it, part of his mind was on the letter. On the line that had been sitting in the back of his head for 10 days now, like a splinter he couldn't reach. Control is not a choice you make, it's just how you breathe. The press didn't move on. He had allowed himself to believe somewhere in the second week that the story would lose oxygen. These things always did. The news cycle had the attention span of a man at a party, perpetually distracted by the next arrival. But Claire's disappearance had a quality that kept people coming back, something in the combination of wealth and pregnancy and vanishing that tapped into something old and unresolved in the public imagination. By the end of the second week, a social media hashtag had accumulated enough momentum that it showed up in his Google alert summary, which Sandra forwarded every morning. The hashtag was something he refused to engage with and also found impossible to fully ignore. It was the kind of thing that accreted commentary the way a car accumulates parking tickets, one after another, each one small, the aggregate eventually requiring attention. The posts were mostly from women. That fact was noted in 2 separate media analyses. Women who had been in controlling relationships. Women who had left men who couldn't understand why they left. Women who called Claire brave or strong, or who simply said, "I see her," in the way people sometimes say things that are really about themselves. He was aware that he was the villain in all of these stories. The controlling billionaire, the man who turned everything into a transaction, including his marriage. He sat with that awareness and turned it over and looked at it the way a doctor looks at a scan, trying to be objective about something that was also deeply personal. The honest answer was, they weren't entirely wrong. He didn't like that. He also couldn't quite argue with it. Sandra came to his office on day 14 to tell him that 2 board members, Marcus Webb and Lydia Thornton, had requested an informal meeting, not an official board session, an informal meeting which was the kind of language that meant the conversation would be careful and the stakes would be real. "What do they want?" he said. "My read?" Sandra set her tablet on his desk. "They want to know if you're okay. They want to know if the company is okay. And they want to hear from you directly rather than reading about you on the internet. Tell them Thursday morning. I already penciled Thursday. I just need you to confirm." "Thursday." She picked up her tablet and turned to go, then stopped. Without turning back, she said, "For whatever it's worth, the people who actually know you don't believe what they're saying out there." "It doesn't matter what they believe," he said. She turned then and looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she thought he was being dense. "It does to them," she said, and left. Ray Kowalski called on the afternoon of the 15th day. "Pittsburgh," he said. "She went Pittsburgh after Cleveland. Bus, under the same name. And from Pittsburgh—" He paused, and in the pause, Damien felt his focus sharpen the way it did at a negotiating table when something moved. "She bought a prepaid phone in Pittsburgh. My contact tracked the activation." "You can trace a prepaid phone?" Not directly, but the activation pinged a tower, and the location puts her somewhere in the Pittsburgh metro area at the time of activation. She wasn't there long, probably just the night. Another pause. She's good at this. Keep going. I'm working the assumption she went northeast, Pittsburgh to somewhere in New England. That's a common corridor. There aren't that many ways to disappear quietly in this country that don't eventually pass through New England if you're a woman traveling alone and you want quiet. Why New England? It's where people go when they want to disappear but also want to breathe. The coast. Small towns. Places where nobody knows you and nobody asks. Ray's voice had a particular quality when he was sharing a professional assessment. A dryness, a weariness, the cadence of someone who had spent years finding people who didn't want to be found and had developed feelings about it. She's not hiding in a city. If she were hiding in a city, she'd have gone somewhere with crowds. Houston, Phoenix, somewhere big enough to vanish into. She went small. She wants quiet. Damien thought about that. He thought about the woman in the letter. The woman who had written 4 handwritten pages in a clear, deliberate script and said, "This isn't a negotiating position. This is just what's true." He thought about the Saturday in Lake Geneva and the look in her eyes and the way she had said, "We're just walking." He thought, she has wanted quiet for a long time. "Keep going northeast," he said. His meeting with Marcus Webb and Lydia Thornton on Thursday morning took place in the small conference room on the 38th floor, the one that didn't have a view of the street, which Damien had always interpreted as a deliberate design choice. Somewhere you could have a conversation without either party being distracted by the fact of the world outside. Marcus was 61, a self-made man from Detroit who had been on the Ashford Capital Board since the company's Series B, and who had the quality of someone who said exactly what he thought precisely, because he could afford to. Lydia was 55, a former attorney who had moved into investment banking in her 40s, and whose precision with language Damien had always admired and occasionally found inconvenient. They had coffee. There was a minute or two of preliminary conversation about the markets, the kind of throat-clearing that precedes something real. Then Marcus said, "How are you actually doing?" "I'm functioning," Damien said. "That's not what I asked." Damien looked at him for a moment. "I know. The search, the media. The board is concerned, and I want to be clear, the concern is not primarily about the quarterly numbers. It's about you. The quarterly numbers are fine. They're not great," Lydia said. She said it the way she said most things, without apology, without embellishment, just the fact. "The Meridian deal stalled. The Castellan acquisition is 3 weeks behind the schedule you presented to us in October. Your COO is covering for you professionally and doing an adequate job. But this company runs on your judgment, Damien, and your judgment has not been fully in the building." He couldn't argue with that either. He didn't try. "Tell me what you need," Marcus said. "Not what you want to project. What you actually need to get through this." Damien was quiet for a moment. In another context, in another version of himself, he might have produced a crisp answer, a plan, a timeline, a projection of when things would return to normal. He had a version of that answer ready. He had been carrying it around for 2 weeks. Instead, he said, "I need to find her, and I don't know what I want to do when I do." That honesty surprised all 3 of them, himself included. Marcus nodded slowly. Lydia looked at her coffee. "Take the time you need," Marcus said, "but take it with your eyes open. This company is not going to run itself, and the people in it need to know you're still here." "I'm still here," Damien said. "Good," Marcus said. "Then act like it." On the 20th day, Damien did something he had been avoiding. He called Diane Cross, Claire's attorney. He didn't tell Preston he was doing it. Preston would have objected, correctly, on the grounds that direct contact with opposing counsel outside formal proceedings was inadvisable. Damien called anyway. Diane Cross picked up after 2 rings, which told him she had been expecting the call. "Mr. Ashford?" "I'm not calling about the case," he said. "I just want to know if she's okay." A careful pause. "I haven't spoken to my client since shortly before her departure from Chicago." "That's not what I asked." A longer pause. "I am not in a position to confirm or deny my client's well-being based on information I may or may not have. I'm sure you understand that." She's okay, he said. Not a question. Diane Cross said nothing for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, I have no reason to believe otherwise. It was the most she could give him without crossing a line, and both of them knew it. Thank you, he said. Mr. Ashford. Her voice shifted slightly. If and when the continued hearing occurs, I would encourage you to consider what outcome you actually want, not what outcome your legal team has been pursuing. What you want. He hung up and sat at his desk and stared at the wall. What he wanted. He had been telling himself he wanted Claire to come back, that he wanted things returned to their previous shape. But sitting there on the 20th day, having slept poorly for 3 weeks, and read her letter 7 times and talked to a board member who had looked at him with more concern than strategy, Damien was not sure that was what he wanted anymore. Or rather, he was not sure it was possible, and he had been confusing what was possible with what he wanted for so long that the two categories had blurred. The search fund was at $3 million by the end of week 3. Ray Kowalski had expanded his team. 2 additional investigators working the Northeast Corridor, a tech specialist pulling whatever data was pullable from Claire's prepaid phone activation, a contact in a regional DM5 office who could run names on a delay. The investigation was comprehensive, meticulous, and still hadn't produced an address. What it had produced was a shape, a direction. She was in New England. Ray was almost certain of it now. The trail pointed there. The Pittsburgh stopover, the Northeast trajectory, the deliberate avoidance of airports and credit cards, the kind of care that suggested someone who had planned for a pursuit and intended to be hard to find but had not quite gone completely off the grid. She's living a life, Ray told him. She's not camping in the woods. She's somewhere she can get prenatal care, probably. Somewhere small enough that she blends in. Small town, coastal, northeast, Damien said. That's still a lot of geography. Narrow it. I'm narrowing it. What neither of them discussed directly was the increasingly clear picture that this was a woman who had not panicked and run. This was a woman who had made a plan, worked it methodically, and executed it with a precision that Damien recognized and found, against his will, a certain reluctant regard for. She had done exactly what she told him she would do. She had left. She had been calm about it. She had not asked for anything. The letter kept coming back to him. The specific sentences, the ones that landed differently on the 7th read than they had on the 1st. I think you built something enormous, and somewhere inside of it, you misplaced the parts of yourself that made you worth knowing. He was not a man who spent a great deal of time on introspection. He had always found it a somewhat inefficient activity, the kind of thing you did when you had run out of more productive options. But the letter had created a kind of persistent low-grade disruption in his thinking that he couldn't root around, couldn't set aside, couldn't outwork. It was just there, the way a sound you can't identify stays in your awareness until you find its source. He had misplaced something. He didn't know exactly when. That was the uncomfortable part. There was no single moment he could point to, no one bad decision, no sharp turn he could remember taking. Just the long, gradual accumulation of a certain way of being in the world. And then one morning he was standing in an empty bedroom with a wedding ring on the nightstand, and his wife was already 400 miles away. Vanessa came by the penthouse again on day 23. He let her in. They ate from the same restaurant. They talked about small things, her consulting work, a deal she was advising on, the early winter that had come down on Chicago hard and fast and turned the lake into something gray and choppy. She waited until they had finished eating before she said what she had come to say. I want to know where we stand, she said. You and me. He looked at her. She was a good-looking woman. That had always been true. It wasn't the interesting part. And she was smart, and she was patient in a way that had always impressed him, and she was sitting across from him now with an expression of someone who had been patient long enough. I don't know, he said. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. She looked at her glass, then at him. I didn't get into this with you to become someone's placeholder. I need you to understand that. I do understand that. Do you? She set her glass down. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your wife left. And instead of moving forward, you've spent 3 weeks. And God knows how much money chasing a woman who has been very clear that she doesn't want to be found. And She stopped. I'm sitting in your kitchen trying to figure out if I'm a person you care about or if I'm just the thing that was convenient before all of this happened. It was a fair question. It deserved a real answer. You were never just convenient, he said. Then what was I? He thought about it. He was tired, genuinely bone-deep tired in a way that had accumulated over 3 weeks of bad sleep and constant low-level crisis management, and the persistent mental weight of a letter he couldn't stop reading. And he was tired of performing certainty he didn't have. You were a version of what I thought I wanted, he said, when what I actually wanted was something I didn't know how to ask for. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. He watched her process it, not theatrically, not with the calculated emotion of a woman performing hurt, but with the genuine quiet of someone absorbing something that lands harder than expected. That's honest, she said finally. I'm trying. She looked at him for a long moment. You know what the problem is? You're smarter than almost anyone in a room, but you're years behind on the obvious things. He didn't have an answer for that. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair and she said, Call me when you figure out what you want. And she left, and the penthouse was quiet again, and he sat in the kitchen alone for a long time before he moved. On day 26, a package arrived. Not from Claire this time. From a woman named Margaret Bellows, identified by the return address as being in Bangor, Maine, a name that meant nothing to him. The package contained a handmade blanket, small and soft and yellow, with a card that said, For the baby. From the women in your wife's life who love her. We don't know you. We hope you're becoming the man she always believed you could be. He held the blanket for a while and felt something he couldn't name. He called Ray that afternoon. Maine, he said. Focus Maine. I'm already there, Ray said. The board meeting on the 28th day went better than it should have. Damien had spent 48 hours doing nothing but work, pure, focused, exhausting work. And he walked into that meeting with numbers that were real and projections that were honest and a plan for the Castellan acquisition that his COO called the clearest strategic framing she had seen from him in 6 months. He sat at the head of that table and performed, credibly, the function of a man running a $4 billion company, and the board responded to it. After the meeting, Marcus Webb walked with him to the elevator and said, Good, keep doing that. I intend to, Damien said. Marcus looked at him, that long, considering look of a man who has known someone for years and is reassessing them. Whatever happens with Claire, he said, take what it's teaching you. The elevator doors opened. Damien stepped in. He thought, standing in the mirrored walls of the elevator descending 40 stories. What is it teaching me? He was still working on that. On the morning of the 30th day, Ray Kowalski called at 7:30. Damien was at his desk. He had coffee. He had been up since 5 reading a risk analysis for a deal in Seoul. He picked up on the first ring. I've got a direction, Ray said. His voice had the slightly tighter quality of someone who has found something real. Not a confirmed address yet, but a direction. There's a coastal town in Maine, small, quiet, the kind of place you can rent a cottage without much paperwork if you know where to look. I've got a name that might match the identity she's been using. I need another few days to confirm. Damien felt the familiar sharpening, the forward lean, the narrowing of focus, the animal pull toward resolution. He sat with it for a moment before he spoke. What name? Something simple. Elaine Morris, no digital footprint prior to about 6 weeks ago, which is consistent with the timeline. Elaine. Her middle name was Elaine. He had known that, filed under the long list of things he knew about his wife that he had never thought much about. A few more days, he said. Maybe less. I have someone on the ground in Maine now. Tell him to be discreet. He's always discreet. Damien hung up and sat at his desk with his coffee growing cold and looked out at Chicago. Gray and cold and enormous and completely indifferent to anything happening in the life of one man on one floor of one building. He thought about a cottage on a coast in Maine. He thought about what Ray had said weeks ago. She's not hiding in a city. She wants quiet. He thought about what a woman who wanted quiet and had built a whole second life, carefully and alone, would feel when the first life came knocking at the door. He thought about what he was actually going to say when he got there. He didn't have an answer yet. He had the plane and the money, and the investigator narrowing the geography day by day. He had a letter he had memorized by now without intending to. He had a boardroom he was running, and a company that needed him, and a woman in his kitchen 2 nights ago who had called him years behind on the obvious things. He had a yellow blanket on the shelf in the study from women in Maine who didn't know him. And he had a son he had never met, who was somewhere on the coast of Maine, being born into a quiet house that his father had no vision of, becoming a person in a world Damien had not yet figured out how to be part of. He picked up his phone and called Ray back. "The few days," he said, "make it fewer." "I'll try," Ray said, which was the only honest answer, and it would have to be enough. Ray Kowalski's investigator on the ground in Maine was a man named Dennis Farrow, 47, former state police, the kind of person who had spent 2 decades learning how to move through small towns without leaving the impression of someone who didn't belong. He drove a used Subaru with a cracked rear bumper sticker and wore Carhartt jackets and ordered coffee at local diners, and talked about the weather with the ease of someone who genuinely didn't mind talking about the weather. He called Ray on the 32nd day. Ray called Damien. "Dennis found the name," Ray said. "Elaine Morris. She's renting a cottage outside a town called Harwick. Small place on the mid-coast, maybe 3,000 year-round residents. The cottage belongs to a woman named Patricia Oakes, who rents it seasonally and stopped asking questions when the cash came in on time." Damien was standing at the window of his office. Below, Chicago was doing its December thing. The wind off the lake, the gray sky pressing down. The particular combination of cold and concrete that made the city feel like it was bracing for something. "Where in Harwick?" he said. "About 2 miles outside town proper, on a road that runs along a salt marsh. The cottage is set back from the road with a wood line behind it." A pause. "Dennis says it's quiet out there. He drove past twice. He saw lights in the window in the evenings." Damien was quiet for a moment. He had been building toward this for 32 days. The calls, the money, the meticulous narrowing of geography. And now that it had arrived, the forward momentum that had carried him this far seemed to stall slightly against the weight of what came next. "Has he seen her?" Damien said. "Once, at the market in town. He didn't approach. She looked—" Ray stopped. "She looked what?" "He said she looked fine. His word. Said she was moving slowly, which is expected given the pregnancy. She bought groceries. She talked to the woman at the register for a few minutes. He said she was laughing at something the woman said." Damien absorbed that. His wife, 8 months and change pregnant, 2 miles outside a small coastal town in Maine, laughing at something a grocery store cashier said. "He's sure it's her," Damien said. "He's sure." "All right." He turned away from the window. "Tell him to stand down. I'll handle it from here." He did not fly to Maine immediately. That surprised even him. He had the jet fueled and available. Preston had already sent him a memo about the legal considerations of appearing at Claire's location, the optics, the potential for a harassment interpretation, the importance of any contact being demonstrably voluntary on her part. Damien had read the memo and filed it. The legal considerations were real. They were also not what was slowing him down. What was slowing him down was a question he had been avoiding for 32 days, and which Diane Cross had put into language for him. What outcome do you actually want? He sat in his apartment that night, the 32nd night, and made himself answer it honestly. Not the answer he had been running on, the reflexive answer, the one that said, "I want my family back. I want things returned to the shape they were." That answer was simple and available, and he had been using it to fuel the search like high-octane avoidance. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the letter, because he still took it out sometimes, still read pieces of it, and he tried to answer the question without the fuel. What he found underneath the fuel was messier and less usable. He missed something he hadn't fully had. He had regret about things he couldn't undo. He had a son he had never seen who was going to be born into a life that Damien had, functionally, already lost the right to be part of. And underneath all of that, under the regret and the missing and the strange, persistent ache of the letter, was something smaller and harder, something that felt a little like the beginning of actual understanding. Not a plan, not a strategy, just the raw, uncomfortable material of a man who had finally run out of ways to be busy. He picked up the letter. I hope you can find them again, but I'm not able to wait around to find out, and my son is not going to be a casualty of the looking. He put the letter down. He called Preston at 9 o'clock. I'm going to Maine, he said. Not tomorrow. Give me a week. A week for what? I need to handle some things here first. Preston was quiet for a moment. The hearing continuance expires in 3 weeks. If she hasn't appeared, I know the timeline. Give me a week. Damien, Preston, give me the week. He spent those 7 days doing something he had not done in 4 years. He worked on the company as if it were the only thing that mattered, and then he went home and sat with himself and thought about what Claire had written. He had his COO, Renata Voss, walk him through every active deal. He sat in on 3 team meetings he normally delegated. He approved the Castellan acquisition on terms that were slightly less favorable than he had originally held out for, which was the right call and which he had been resisting for 3 weeks out of stubbornness. He called 2 board members individually, not to manage them, just to talk through the Q4 picture honestly. He wrote a response memo to the sole risk analysis that his team said was the clearest strategic thinking they had seen from him since the second quarter. He also called Marla Chen. She picked up on the 4th ring, cautious. Damien, I'm not calling to ask about Claire, he said. I already know where she is. A silence. Oh. I'm calling because you were her closest friend, and I think you probably know things about how she experienced our marriage that I don't know. And I think, before I go to Maine, I should hear some of it. A longer silence. He could hear Marla Chen deciding whether to trust him. He didn't rush it. That's unexpected, she said finally. I know. Why now? Because I've had a month to figure out I don't actually have a plan. I just have a destination. She was quiet for another moment, then she exhaled. Okay, you want to do this on the phone or coffee, he said. I'll come to you. He met Marla Chen at a small place on the north side the next morning. She was already there when he arrived, a compact woman in her early 40s with paint on her jacket and the kind of direct gaze that had always made him faintly uncomfortable. He sat down. He ordered coffee. He waited. She was lonely, Marla said. She didn't ease into it. I know that's not what you want to hear, and I also think you already know it, so I'm just going to say it. She was lonely inside her marriage for a long time. Not because you were mean to her. You weren't mean to her. You were just absent. Not physically, just present but not there, Damien said. Marla looked at him with something that was not quite surprise. Yeah. She used different words in the letter, but the same idea. She talked about leaving for about a year before she actually did it, Marla said. I told her to talk to you. She tried. You would listen, and then the next week everything would be exactly the same. She said it was like talking to someone who could hear the sounds but couldn't decode them into meaning. He received that without reaction. It landed, and he let it. She planned the leaving very carefully, Marla said. I want you to know I knew she was planning it, but I didn't know the specific timing. She was protecting me. She didn't want me to be in a position where I'd have to lie to you. I know, he said. She's been protecting people her whole life. Marla looked at him. That's the first time I've ever heard you say something that sounds like you actually see her. He didn't answer that. He drank his coffee. Outside, the north side of Chicago was doing its neighborhood morning. The foot traffic, the dog walkers, the coffee shop filling up, life in its ordinary, continuous motion. She's going to be okay, Marla said. In Maine, She stopped herself. I don't know her situation there specifically. I'm just saying she was built for exactly the life she's building. I know, he said again. He drove back to the penthouse and packed a bag. He flew to Portland on a Friday, a gray December morning that matched the landscape he descended into. Low clouds, bare trees, the Atlantic making itself known in the quality of the light before you could even see it. He rented a car at the airport under his own name, which was probably a mistake from a discreet entry standpoint, and which he had decided he didn't care about. He was done with the indirection. Harwick was 90 minutes north of Portland, along a coast road that ran through small towns with white churches and hardware stores, and the occasional lobster shack closed for the season. He drove with the window cracked despite the cold, because the smell of the ocean was real in a way that the recycled air of his apartment and his office and his car in Chicago had stopped being. He hadn't been out of the city in 4 months. He noticed that now, the way you notice something you've been ignoring as soon as the thing that was distracting you drops away. He passed through Harwick proper, a main street with a post office, a diner called Cowan's, a hardware store, a small grocery with a handwritten sign in the window advertising local honey, and followed Ray's directions along the marsh road. 2 miles out, a gravel turnoff, a cottage set back from the road with a wood line behind it, exactly as Dennis Farrow had described. He pulled over on the road before the turnoff and sat in the car for several minutes. He had $3 million invested in finding this place. He had 32 days of obsession and sleeplessness and board meetings and a letter he had memorized. He had an attorney waiting in Chicago and a rescheduled hearing and an entire company that had been half-managed for a month. He had all of that behind him, and what he had in front of him was a gravel driveway and a small cottage with a light on in the window, and his son somewhere inside, and he had no idea what to say. He got out of the car. The cold was real, a different cold than Chicago, saltier, with a quality of dampness in it that went straight through his coat. The marsh was visible through the trees to his left, gray-brown and still, the water barely distinguishable from the sky. He stood on the road for a moment. Then he turned up the gravel drive. He had not gotten more than 20 feet before the front door opened. He stopped. The woman who stepped onto the small porch was not who he had expected to see. Vanessa Hale stood in the doorway of the cottage, her hand on the door frame, her expression doing something complicated and fast. Surprise, then calculation, then a rapid assembly into neutrality that told him she had been caught in the middle of something she had not expected to be interrupted. Damien stood on the gravel driveway in the December cold and stared at her. "What are you doing here?" he said. It was not quite a question. Vanessa stepped fully onto the porch and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. She was dressed for the weather, heavy coat, boots, her hair pulled back. She looked, he noted with a detached part of his mind, like someone who had driven a long way and was feeling the effort of it. "I found her first," Vanessa said. The sentence landed in the cold air between them. "How?" Damien said. "Does it matter?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Claire mentioned a place once, at a dinner at your apartment, 3 years ago, one of those dinners you had for the Ashford Foundation board. She was talking to a woman from the foundation about where she'd grown up spending summers. She mentioned a town on the Maine coast. She mentioned the marsh road and the salt air, and how she hadn't been there since she was 12. Vanessa paused. "You were across the room talking about yield curves. You didn't hear it." "But you did," he said. "I was paying attention." He understood what she was saying. She had been paying attention at his dinner party 3 years ago to a conversation his wife had with someone else, and she had remembered it. And when his $3 million investigation had stalled, she had driven to Maine with a piece of information she had been holding quietly for 32 days. "What did you say to her?" he said. "We were still talking when you pulled up." "What were you going to say to her?" Vanessa looked at him. The complicated thing was back in her expression, the calculation and something else under it that he hadn't seen on her face before, something that was not quite shame but was adjacent to it. "I was going to tell her that I'd keep quiet about finding her," she said, "in exchange for a certain amount of money." The cold between them felt sharper. "That was the plan," he said. "That was the plan." He looked at her for a long moment. He had known Vanessa Hale for 2 years. He had told himself, that he knew what she was. He had not thought she was this. "How much?" he said. "I hadn't gotten to the number yet." She met his eyes directly. There was something in her face that was almost defiant. A woman who had gone far enough that retreat wasn't really available, so she was standing her ground. She wasn't going to be intimidated, if that's what you're wondering. She opened the door and looked at me, and she wasn't scared. She was She looked at me like she already knew everything, like nothing I could say was going to change anything fundamental. Because she does know, Damien said, and nothing was. Vanessa looked away. For a moment, she looked out at the marsh road, at the gray December light, at the bare trees and the still water. She looked like a person taking inventory of where she had ended up. She said she needed a few minutes, Vanessa said quietly, before talking to me. That's why I was at the door. She went inside. Damien walked past Vanessa up the 2 porch steps and knocked on the door. A silence from inside. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The door opened. Claire Bennett stood in the doorway of the cottage with one hand on the doorframe and one hand low on her belly. She was larger than he had imagined, the pregnancy now visibly close to full term. She was wearing a gray sweater and her hair was different, shorter by a few inches, pulled behind her ear on one side. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise, not fear, not anger. It was the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had decided in advance exactly how they were going to be when it arrived. "Damien," she said. "Claire." She looked past him at Vanessa on the porch below, then back at him. "I see she called ahead." "She didn't call," he said. "I followed her." Claire looked at him for a moment. "That tracks," she said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of the cottage was small and lived in a way that the penthouse had never been. There was a wood stove with a fire going, and a couch with a blanket on it, and a bookshelf with a mix of paperbacks and what looked like pregnancy and parenting books, and 2 or 3 novels with library stickers on the spines. On the kitchen table, there was a half-finished cup of tea and a library book open face down. The yellow blanket from the package, the one that had arrived at the penthouse, was folded on the arm of the couch. He recognized it and felt something move in his chest. She sat down at the kitchen table and gestured at the chairs across from her. He sat. Vanessa had followed them in and was standing near the door with the expression of someone who understood they had lost control of the situation and was waiting to see what came next. Claire looked at Vanessa first. Her voice was calm. "Whatever you came here to propose, I'm not interested. I want you to know that whatever it is, the answer is no, and I'd like you to leave." Vanessa looked at her for a moment, then she looked at Damien. "Vanessa," Damien said, "get a hotel in town. I'll call you." Vanessa said nothing. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door and left. The door closed behind her. Outside, her car started on the gravel. Then quiet. Claire watched the door for a moment after it closed. Then she looked at Damien. Her hands were flat on the table. She wasn't performing anything. Not bravery, not coldness, not vulnerability. She was just sitting there being exactly who she was. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About an hour before you pulled up. A woman appeared at my door. A woman who was at our apartment for dinner once and who I never trusted for reasons I could never fully articulate." She looked at her hands. "It took me about 4 seconds to understand what she was doing here." "I'm sorry." "Which part are you sorry for?" He thought about that. He was aware that this was a question that deserved a specific answer, and not a general one. "For the investigation, for the money, and the people I sent. For making you feel, for making it necessary for you to be this careful." She looked at him. "That's more honest than I expected. I've had a month to get more honest. Or a month to practice what to say when you got here." "Both," he said. "Probably both. I'm not sure I can fully separate them yet." She seemed to consider that. She picked up her tea, found it cold, and set it back down. "What do you want, Damien?" "I don't know," he said. "I kept telling myself I was coming here to take you home, that you'd come back, or I'd convince you to come back, or some version of this would end with things going back to how they were." He looked at the wood stove. The fire was working steadily. "And then I sat in my car on the road out there for 5 minutes before I could make myself get out. And I realized I don't actually want that. I want—" He stopped. "I don't have a clean sentence for what I want." "Try the messy one," she said. He looked at her. "I want to know him," he said. "My son. I want to be something real to him, not a figure in a legal document and not a name in a financial trust. I know I don't have the right to ask for that. I know that I I understand that I built the situation we're in. I'm not coming here to undo that. He stopped again. I needed to be in the same room with you and say that I read your letter and I understood it. Really understood it. Not as a position in a negotiation, as the truth. The fire in the wood stove popped. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Claire was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful and exact, the way it was when she wanted to be heard precisely. You understand what I wrote in the letter. I believe you. I also know that understanding something and changing because of it are two different things, and I've watched you understand things and not change for 4 years. I know, he said, so I need you to know that I'm not going back. Not to Chicago, not to the penthouse, not to any version of the life we had. I am going to raise my son, our son, here, or somewhere like here, and I am going to give him a life that actually has air in it. That's not negotiable. I'm not here to negotiate. She looked at him. Damien, you are constitutionally incapable of entering a room without negotiating. He almost laughed. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in a month. I'm working on that, he said. She studied him. There was something in her face that was not softening exactly, more like adjusting, the way a camera adjusts to a different light. You look terrible, she said. I know. You've been sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. 3, mostly. She shook her head slightly, not with the contempt he might have deserved, not with the satisfaction of a woman watching a man suffer consequences, with something that was closer to tired sorrow, the expression of someone who had cared about a person for a long time and was not entirely done caring, even when the caring hadn't been returned in kind. I can't fix that for you, she said. I know. And I can't go back to being something you need to have, like a part of the portfolio. You understand that? Yes. She was quiet again. She put one hand on her belly. The gesture so automatic she probably didn't notice it. The gesture of a woman who had been doing that for months, keeping her hand close to the thing she was carrying. He's due in 3 weeks, she said. I know. I'd like you to be informed. When he's born, I think you should know. She paused. But I need you to agree to some things first. Legal things. Things that protect him and protect me before any of that happens. Name them, he said. I'll have Diane Cross send the terms. You'll sign them or you won't. That's the whole conversation right now. She looked at him steadily. And I need to know what she wanted. She tilted her head slightly toward the door. You're Vanessa. I need to know what she was planning to ask for. She was going to ask you for money, he said, in exchange for not telling me where you were. Claire looked at him. Did you send her? No. She read his face for a moment, the way she had always been able to read his face when she was paying attention, which was more often than he had realized. I believe you, she said finally. That doesn't make it better. I know. The people around you... She stopped. The people around you are a reflection of something, Damien. I've been thinking about that for a month too. He didn't have an answer for that either. He had a lot of things he didn't have answers for. That was new. He had always had answers. Fast ones, confident ones. The kind that closed conversations before they became uncomfortable. What he had now instead was a fire going in a wood stove, in a small cottage on a salt marsh in December, and the woman he had spent 4 years managing instead of knowing, and no answer at all. I'll have Diane send the terms tomorrow, Claire said. She stood, slowly, with the slight effortfulness of late pregnancy, one hand on the table. I'd like you to go now. Not because I'm angry, just because I'm tired and I need to think. He stood. Okay. He picked up his coat from the chair where he'd set it. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. At the cottage that was already entirely hers, the blanket on the couch, the library book face down on the table, the evidence of a life being built quietly and with real attention. The yellow blanket, he said. I got one too. Different women sent me one. They said they hoped I was becoming the man you always believed I could be. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Were they wrong? He said. She was quiet for a long moment. I'll let you know, she said. He nodded. He walked out onto the porch and down the gravel drive. The cold hit him full in the face. The marsh was still and gray to his left, and the light was the particular muted silver of a December afternoon in Maine, and somewhere in the woodline a bird was doing something persistent. He got in the car. He sat there for a minute. Then he took out his phone and called Preston. "Tell me what agreeing to her terms looks like," he said. "All of them. Whatever she asks for. I want to know what agreeing looks like before I see the document." "Damien, I'm not asking for your analysis yet. I'm asking for information." Preston started talking. Damien listened. Outside, the light was dropping over the marsh, the water going from gray to something darker, and the cottage light was warm and visible through the trees, and his son was in there somewhere, 3 weeks from being in the world, becoming real in a way that Damien was only now beginning to understand was already beyond his control. He thought about what Vanessa had said on the porch. She opened the door and looked at me, and she wasn't scared. He thought, of course she wasn't. He had spent 32 days and $3 million finding a woman who had never been lost. Preston was still talking. Damien listened, and the darkness came down over the Maine coast, and he stayed in the car until Preston was finished. Preston sent the terms the next morning. Damien was in a room at the only inn Harwick had to offer, a converted farmhouse on the main road called the Tidewater, run by a retired couple who asked no questions and provided coffee at 6 in the morning without being asked, which was the only amenity he actually needed. He had slept 5 hours, which was more than he had managed in weeks. He wasn't sure if it was the salt air or the exhaustion or the particular relief of a man who had stopped pretending he had a plan. He read the terms on his phone at the small desk by the window while the inn's radiator clicked and the light came up pale over the marsh road outside. Diane Cross had written them with the precision of someone who had been building toward this document for months. They were not punitive in the way he had expected. They were structural. Claire was asking for the full restoration of her 12% equity stake in Ashford Capital, free of any challenge or encumbrance. She was asking for a property settlement that reflected her actual contribution to the company in its early years, which Diane had documented in an attachment that ran to 11 pages and which Damien read carefully and found, with the particular discomfort of a man confronting his own accounting, to be accurate. She was asking for sole physical custody of their son, with Damien having visitation rights structured around a schedule to be agreed upon. Not denied, not minimized, but structured and predictable and subject to modification as the child grew. She was asking for child support at a level that his attorneys would call generous, and which he looked at and thought, it's fair. She was not asking him to disappear. She was not asking for punishment. She was asking for the specific things that had been taken from her or never fully given, laid out in clean legal language that had the quality of something compiled by a woman who had been thinking about this for a long time and had finally found the moment to say it all at once. He read the document twice. Then he called Preston. "I've read it," he said. "I saw it come in last night. Damien, the equity restoration alone is going to... I know what it's going to do." "Your board?" "The board will be informed after I sign it, not before." A silence. Preston had been his attorney for 8 years and had developed, over those 8 years, a particular quality of silence that meant he was deciding whether to push back or whether the moment had passed for pushing back. "All of it?" Preston said. "All of it," Damien said. "Send me a clean version with signature lines. I want it done before I leave Maine." Another silence. Shorter this time. "I'll have it to you by noon," Preston said. He had 4 hours before noon. He drove into town, ate breakfast at Cowan's Diner, eggs, toast, coffee that was too strong and slightly burnt, which he drank 2 cups of anyway, and sat at the counter and looked at the main street of Harwick through the diner window. A Tuesday morning in December. The hardware store was open. The post office had a small line. A man in a lobster boat jacket was talking to someone outside the grocery while a dog sat patiently between them. The woman behind the counter at Cowan's was in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the efficient warmth of someone who had been feeding strangers for a long time. She refilled his coffee without asking. He thought about what Dennis Farrow had said. She was laughing at something the woman at the register said. He thought about which register, which woman, and whether it was the grocery or somewhere else, and then he stopped himself because it was not information he needed. and the tracking impulse was the thing he was supposed to be working against. He paid and went back to the Tidewater and waited for Preston's document. It arrived at 11:47. He read it once. He signed it electronically. He sent it back. He sat for a moment after he sent it, his phone on the desk, and felt the particular sensation of having made an irrevocable decision. Not the sick drop of a mistake, but the strange stillness of something that has been resisted for a long time finally being released. 4 years of a marriage, $3 million and 32 days, a letter he had memorized, and now a signature on a document that said, "I am letting go of the version of this that I wanted it to be." He was aware it was not a redemptive moment. It did not feel like one. It felt like a man sitting in a room at a small inn in Maine with a radiator clicking and a view of a marsh road, having signed a piece of paper that he should have signed, or rather, that the conversation it represented should have happened, years ago. He picked up his phone and called Claire. She answered after 3 rings. "Preston sent me the signed document," she said. No preamble. "I know. I wanted you to know it was me, not just the signature." A pause. "I appreciate that. I'd like to come by the cottage today, not to negotiate anything. That's done. He stopped. He had been about to say, "I just want to see you," but that sentence belonged to something else, a different kind of conversation. "I want to see where you're living," he said instead. "I want to understand the life you've built, before I go back." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the cottage in the background, the faint sound of wind, the wood stove probably, the particular quiet of a house that had only one person in it and was at peace with that fact. "Come at 2, she said. "I need the morning." He arrived at 2 o'clock. He knocked. She opened the door without the wariness of the day before. Not warm, not cold, but present in a different way. She had slept, he could tell. She was wearing the same gray sweater, but her shoulders were different, less braced. "Come in," she said. He came in. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. He sat at the table where they had talked the day before, and the cottage looked the same. The wood stove, the blanket, the library book, the mix of ordinary things that someone had selected not for appearance, but for use. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Heavy," she said, with the directness of someone who is past managing her answers for the benefit of the questioner. "My back hurts. I'm not sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. The midwife says everything is where it should be." She brought 2 mugs to the table. Tea, not coffee. She had always preferred tea. He had never learned to drink it, and she had stopped offering him coffee years ago, and he had never asked why. He wrapped his hands around the mug. The tea was fine. "I signed everything," he said. "I know. Diane called me. I want to be clear that it wasn't reluctant. I know it probably looked reluctant, given the timing. But when I actually read what you were asking for, it was all fair. All of it." She looked at him. "I know it was fair. That's why I asked for it. I mean, I should have. Some of it I should have offered years ago. The equity. What you did in the first 3 years of the company was real, and I let my attorneys argue it away from you, and I shouldn't have." She was quiet for a moment. She turned her mug in a slow circle on the table. "Why didn't you?" "Because I had stopped seeing your contributions as something separate from mine," he said. "Everything you did I had filed under the category of ours in a way that really meant mine. That was wrong." She looked at him steadily. "That is the most direct thing you have ever said to me about this. I have 4 years of indirect to make up for." "You do," she said, "and I want to be honest with you. One direct conversation in a cottage in Maine doesn't make up for it. I'm not saying that to be hard on you. I'm saying it because I think you're the kind of person who needs to hear it spelled out, or you'll register this as a transaction that has been completed." He felt that land. "I understand. Do you?" "I'm trying to." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her tea. "I'm not punishing you," she said. "I want you to know that. The terms, the distance, the life I'm building here, none of it is about punishment. It's about what's actually true, what's actually good for him." Her hand moved to her belly again, that automatic gesture. He needs a father who is present, not a man who controls things from a distance and calls it love. "I know. I'm not sure you do yet. But I think you're capable of learning it. She paused. That's more than I believed 6 months ago. He held that. It was not forgiveness, it was not absolution. It was something smaller and more practical, and in some ways more valuable. A genuine assessment from a person who was not interested in flattering him. What's his name? Damien asked. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like a door opening slightly to let some light through. Ethan, she said. Ethan James. He nodded. He said the name quietly to himself, not quite out loud. You like it, she said. It was not a question. I like it, he said. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the company, not about the terms, not about Chicago. They talked about the cottage, how she had found it, the landlady Patricia, who had asked no questions, and who had shown up 3 weeks ago with a casserole and a phone number and said for when the time comes. They talked about the midwife, a woman named Ruth, who drove out from Harwick twice a week, and who Claire described as the most unflappable person she had ever met. They talked about the grocery store and the diner and the hardware store owner who had helped her weather strip the cottage windows for $20 and refused to take more. He listened. He listened in the way he had rarely listened to her in 4 years, not assembling a response while she talked, not monitoring the conversation for its implications, just listening to what she was actually saying. She was describing a life, a small one by any external measure, a library card and a local midwife and a landlady with casseroles and weather-stripped windows on a salt marsh in December. And the way she talked about it, the specific, unhurried way she described these ordinary things, told him everything the letter had tried to tell him. That what she had here was something she had never had in the penthouse, and it had nothing to do with money. You're happy, he said. It came out slightly like an observation and slightly like something else. She considered it. Yeah, I think I am. Or I'm getting there. There's a lot of quiet here. I wasn't sure I could handle it at first. I spent the first week waiting for something to demand my attention, some crisis, some schedule, something to manage. She paused. And then nothing did, and I had to figure out what to do when there was nothing to manage except yourself. How do you do that? He asked. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was close to gentle, though not quite. You sit still, she said, and you let the day be what it is. He thought about 5:15 in the morning and Chicago and coffee without tasting it. He said nothing. She stood eventually, slowly, with the effort of a woman in the last weeks of pregnancy. One hand on the table, a brief reorganization of herself before she was fully upright. He stood too. I should rest, she said. I'm supposed to be horizontal for at least 2 hours in the afternoon. Ruth's orders. I'll go. He carried the mugs to the sink. It was an instinctive thing, a small thing, and she looked at him when he did it with an expression he couldn't fully read. He put on his coat. He stood at the door. When he comes, he said, I want to be here. I know there are terms, and I know it's your call. I'm not asking for something you haven't agreed to. I'm just saying I want to be reachable. When it happens. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll have Ruth call you, she said. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. He walked down the gravel drive. The cold was the same, salt and dampness and the particular sharpness of a coastal December. He got in the car. He sat for a moment looking at the cottage, at the light in the window and the smoke from the wood stove chimney going straight up into the still afternoon air, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He could not name it precisely. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was something smaller and more uncomfortable, the feeling of a man who has been wrong for a long time and has finally stopped. Tiem. He dealt with Vanessa that evening. She was at the inn when he got back, sitting in the small common room off the lobby with a glass of wine and her laptop open, projecting the composed air of someone who had made peace with the situation and was waiting for the conversation that came next. He had known she would be. He had known she wouldn't just leave. He sat across from her. He didn't order anything. She won't take the money, Vanessa said, before he could speak. I know that. I knew it when I got here, honestly. She stopped. She closed her laptop. I don't know what I was thinking. I think you were thinking you wanted leverage, he said. I think you've wanted leverage over this situation for 2 years, and this was the first time you saw an opening. She looked at her wine. That's not... She stopped again. That's probably accurate. What you did, he said carefully, was drive to Maine to extort a woman who is 9 months pregnant and living alone and has done nothing to you except exist in the way between you and what you wanted. He kept his voice level. He was not performing calm. He was just tired of performing anything. I need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend that's okay. Vanessa looked at him. Her expression was doing the complicated thing it had done on the porch, the calculation, and the thing underneath it. I understand that. Whatever we were, he said, it's done. I think you know that. I think you knew it before you drove up here. Maybe I came here to see for myself, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. Not small, just quieter. What you're willing to do for her. What you're not willing to do. She paused. You signed everything she asked for. I did. That's not the Damien Ashford I've known for 2 years. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was not quite grief. She and Damien had never had the kind of relationship that produced real grief when it ended. But it was something. The recognition, maybe, of a version of the future she had been carrying that was now definitively not going to happen. What are you going to do? She said. Go back to Chicago, run my company, figure out how to be a decent father to a son I haven't met yet. And that's it. That's enough, he said. That's more than I've actually been doing. She nodded slowly. She picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking. For what it's worth, she said, she's impressive. I went there expecting... I don't know what I expected. Someone frightened, maybe. Someone I could manage. She paused. She opened the door and just looked at me like she had all day, and none of it was going to touch her. I know, he said. You spent 4 years underestimating that. I know that too. He stood. He looked at her for a moment. At the woman he had spent 2 years treating as a solution to a problem he had never honestly named. Take care of yourself, Vanessa, he said. And he meant it, because whatever she had done, he had built the situation that made it possible, and he was not entirely without responsibility for who she had become in relation to him. She looked up at him. She said nothing. He walked out of the common room and up the stairs to his room, and he packed his bag, and in the morning he drove back to Portland and flew to Chicago. The call came 18 days later. He was in his office at 7 in the morning, working his way through a contract review, when his phone lit up with a main number he didn't recognize. He picked it up on the first ring. Mr. Ashford. A woman's voice, calm, professional, warm in the way of someone who did this often and understood its weight. My name is Ruth Crandall. I'm Claire's midwife. He was already standing. He didn't remember standing up. Is she okay? She's doing very well, Ruth said. Labor started around 4 this morning. We're at the hospital in Rockland. She wanted you to know. She's asked me to tell you that you're welcome to come, but there's no obligation and she'll understand either way. He was already moving around the desk, reaching for his coat. I'm on my way, he said. It may be several hours yet. First babies take their time. I'll be there. He called his assistant from the elevator, told her to file the contract review and cancel his morning, said he would be unreachable until further notice. He called the airport. He drove to Midway with his jaw set and his hand steady on the wheel, and something in his chest that he still didn't have a name for, only larger now, pressing against his sternum like something trying to get out. The flight to Portland was an hour 20. He drove the 90 minutes north to Rockland in just over 70. He found the hospital, a small regional facility, nothing like the Chicago hospitals he associated with managed, scheduled, premium tier everything. He parked and went inside and told the woman at the front desk his name. She looked at her computer. Claire Bennett? Yes. She mentioned you might come. A slight pause, the kind that contains a small assessment. Room 214. She said you could wait in the family area outside the room. She'll let you know when. He sat in the family area outside room 214 and waited. The hallway was quiet in the particular way of small hospital hallways. The occasional soft footstep, the distant sound of a monitor, the low voices of nurses at the station at the end of the corridor. There were plastic chairs and a table with old magazines and a window that looked out over a parking lot with a view of the sky beyond it, which was the flat gray of a Maine winter morning. He sat in one of the plastic chairs and did not take out his phone. He did not review documents or check markets or call Preston or do any of the things he normally did when waiting, because all of those things were about filling a silence, and this silence was not something he wanted to fill. He waited for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Ruth came out of the room at 10:17. She was a compact woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the practiced calm of someone who had attended a great many births and had not lost the sense that each one was significant. "He's here," she said. "Healthy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Claire's doing well. She's tired, but she's good." She paused. "She's asking if you'd like to come in." He stood. He was aware that his hands were not entirely steady, which was new. Damien Ashford's hands were always steady. He followed Ruth to the door. The room was dim, the overhead lights low, the winter light coming through a narrow window in a soft gray bar. Claire was in the bed, propped up on pillows, her face carrying the complex wreckage of a woman who had just done the hardest physical thing a person can do. Pale and exhausted and entirely present in a way he had never seen on her face before. And in her arms, wrapped in a white hospital blanket, was a very small person with a red scrunched face and one tiny hand visible at the edge of the blanket, fisted tightly. Damien stopped inside the door. He looked at his son. He had prepared, in the way he prepared for everything, some version of this moment. He had thought about what he would say, how he would look, what the appropriate register of the moment required. And then he was standing inside the door of a dim hospital room in Rockland, Maine, and none of it was available. He had nothing prepared. He was just standing there, looking at a person who was 3 hours old and 7 pounds 4 ounces and entirely real in a way that no amount of preparation had made him ready for. "Come in," Claire said. Her voice was rough from exhaustion. She looked at him with the careful, measuring look she had had at the cottage, the look that was doing an honest assessment without performing anything. And then she looked down at the baby. "Ethan," she said quietly, "your dad is here." Damien crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at his son from a distance of about 2 feet, at the small face and the fisted hand and the complete, oblivious, sovereign existence of someone who had just arrived in the world and had no idea what any of it meant. "He has your forehead," Claire said. "Poor kid," Damien said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "for having Ruth call me." "He should know you," she said. "That's not a gift I'm giving you. It's what's right for him." "I know. Don't make me regret it." "I'm going to try not to," he said, which was the most honest promise he had available. She shifted slightly, adjusting the baby. "Do you want to hold him?" He looked at Ethan, at the small bundle and the tiny hand and the complete foreignness of it. He had held babies before, at various life events, with the dutiful ease of someone performing a social function. This was not that. "Yes," he said. She transferred the baby carefully. He took him, both hands, the way Ruth demonstrated without being asked, the way his body seemed to understand before his mind did. And Ethan made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a comment, and then settled. Damien sat in the plastic chair in the dim room and held his son and said nothing. The weight of him. That was what he was not prepared for. Not the emotion, not the complicated interior weather of the moment, but the simple, physical, undeniable weight of a person in his arms. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Less than a bag of flour. Entirely, completely, irreversibly real. He looked up at Claire. She was watching him with her tired, honest eyes. Not with softness, not with a warmth that forgave everything, but with the careful attention of a woman who was watching a man have an experience she had been watching him avoid for years. "I know what I cost you," he said. The sentence came out low and not quite steady. "I know what I cost both of you. I don't—" He stopped. He looked at Ethan's small face. "I don't have a way to undo it. I just want you to know that I understand it now. Not as a position, Not as something I'm saying because it's what the moment calls for. Claire looked at him for a long moment. I hear you, she said. It was not forgiveness. She was not there yet, and he did not expect her to be and would not have fully trusted it if she had been. I hear you was what it was. Acknowledgement. A door cracked slightly, the beginning of a different kind of accounting. He looked back down at Ethan. The baby had one hand free now, the fist slowly opening and closing against the air, looking for something to hold on to in the way that all new people do, reaching out at a world they have not yet learned to navigate, trusting without evidence that something will be there. Damien put his finger against his son's open palm. Ethan's hand closed around it. He sat there in the dim room with the gray light coming through the window and his son's hand around his finger and the complicated weight of 4 years of wrong choices pressing against the specific, present, irreplaceable rightness of this particular moment, and he did not try to reconcile them. He just sat. He let it be what it was. Outside the window, the winter sky sat low over the Maine coast, and the day moved forward the way days do, without asking anyone's permission, carrying everything and everyone along with it into whatever came next. Ethan James Bennett Ashford was 3 days old when Damien drove back to Portland and flew home to Chicago. He had stayed those 3 days in Rockland at a different inn than the Tidewater, a place closer to the hospital, smaller, run by a man named Gordon who cooked breakfast at 7 and left you alone the rest of the time, which was exactly what Damien needed. Each morning he drove to the hospital. Each morning Claire let him in. Each morning he sat in the chair beside the bed and held Ethan for stretches of time that had no agenda, no schedule, no outcome he was managing toward. Just the weight of the baby in his arms and the particular silence of a room where someone very new was learning to exist. Claire slept when she could. Ruth came and went. The nurses were professional and kind and carefully neutral about the man in the chair, who was clearly not a husband and not quite a visitor, and who always brought coffee for the nurse's station without being asked, because it was the one useful thing he could think to do. On the second day, he and Claire talked for a long time after Ethan fell asleep. Not about the company or the terms or any of the structural things that had already been resolved. They talked about the future in the practical, unromantic way of two people who share something irreducible and have stopped pretending otherwise. Visitation. Holidays. How they would handle the conversations Ethan would eventually have about why his parents lived in different places and what their relationship was. Claire was direct and clear and occasionally blunt in a way he had always responded to and had spent 4 years trying to manage away from, because her clarity had so frequently illuminated things he didn't want illuminated. I need you to be consistent, she said. Whatever you commit to, visits, calls, showing up, it has to be consistent. He can handle absence better than he can handle unreliability. Kids don't break from not having everything. They break from not being able to predict the people they love. I'll be consistent, he said. She looked at him with the honest eyes. I need that to be a real commitment, not a performance of one. I know the difference, he said. Then, I'm learning the difference. She held his gaze for a moment. That's actually a better answer, she said. On the third morning, when he arrived, she was up, sitting in the chair instead of the bed, Ethan in her arms, looking out the window at the parking lot and the winter sky beyond it with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and is beginning to understand what it means to be there. She looked better, still tired, still marked by it, but inhabiting herself again in the way she had at the cottage, present, settled, pointed in a direction. He sat on the edge of the bed. He held Ethan for a while. Then he laid him in the small hospital bassinet where he slept with the profound indifference of someone who has not yet learned that there is anything to be anxious about. I'm going back today, Damien said. I know. I'll call, not to check in on you, just to hear how he is. You can call. She paused. Give me a few weeks to get settled at the cottage. Then we'll set up a schedule. Whatever you need, she looked at him. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to say something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way your defensive instincts are going to want to translate it. Okay, what you did, coming here, signing everything, sitting in that chair for 3 days, it matters. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. You showed up in a way you haven't in a long time, maybe ever. She looked at her hands in her lap. But I need you to know that this, me letting you in, me having Ruth call you, the schedule we're going to build, none of it is a path back to what we were. I need you to understand that clearly, because I know you, and I know how you read situations, and I don't want you to spend the next year being a good father as a strategy for something else. He looked at her for a long time. The honest answer, the one that a month ago he might have deflected or dressed up, was that she was right to say it. That some part of him had, in some quiet corner, been doing exactly that math, the part that still spoke in leverage and positioning and long-game calculation. I hear you, he said. And then, because she deserved the fuller truth, you're right that part of me was thinking that way. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I want you to know that when I held him this morning, that wasn't strategy. That was just me holding my son. She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you to keep doing that part. Just that part. He nodded. He stood. He looked one more time at Ethan in the bassinet. The small face, the closed eyes, the fist against his cheek. He picked up his coat and walked to the door. He stopped and turned back because there was one more thing, and it had been sitting in him for 3 days waiting for the right moment, and this was the only moment left. In the letter, he said, you wrote that you hoped I could find the parts of myself I'd misplaced. I just want you to know, I'm looking. I don't know if that means anything to you at this point, but I wanted you to know it's real. She looked at him from across the room. It means something, she said. I don't know yet what exactly, but it means something. He left. Chicago greeted him the way it always did in December. The cold off the lake, the density of the city pressing in from all sides, the noise and the scale, and the relentless purposefulness of a place that did not pause to ask whether you were ready. He was back in the penthouse by 7 that evening. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the space that had been so heavy with absence for 5 weeks, and felt it differently now. Not lighter, just different. The absence was still there, Claire's mug, her absence from the rooms, but it had resolved into something with a more defined shape, not loss in the open-ended, unprocessed way of the first weeks, just the clear, final form of a life that had changed. He made coffee. He stood at the window. He thought about Ethan's hand closing around his finger in the dim hospital room, and he held that, and he let himself hold it without immediately turning it into something he needed to act on. Then he opened his laptop and went back to work. The weeks that followed had a quality he hadn't experienced in years, the quality of days with actual weight to them, days where what happened mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with quarterly numbers or market position. He worked. He worked hard and well, with a focus that his team noticed and commented on in the quiet way people comment on something that is returned after an absence. The Castellan acquisition closed. The Soul deal moved forward. He promoted Renata Voss to a role that more accurately reflected what she had actually been doing for the past 4 years, which was running large portions of the company while he ran the strategy, and which he had been underpaying her for. Sandra Park came into his office the week after the promotion and said, "Good," which from Sandra was an extended standing ovation. He called Claire the second week of January, as she had asked him to wait. She picked up after 2 rings. He could hear the cottage in the background, the wood stove, he imagined, the particular quiet of the marsh road. "How is he?" Damien asked. "Loud," she said, and there was something in her voice that was entirely new, a tiredness that had warmth in it, the specific exhaustion of someone who is up at 2 in the morning and 3 and 5, and who would not, if given the choice, be anywhere else. He's figured out that if he cries, I come, and he finds this extremely satisfying. "Smart kid," Damien said. "Annoyingly smart," she said. They talked for 20 minutes. Not long, not weighted with everything that was behind them. Just 2 people talking about a baby who had learned that crying produced results, and what Ruth had said at the last visit, and whether Patricia Oakes was going to let Claire extend the cottage rental through spring, which she had agreed to do for a rate that Claire described as embarrassingly reasonable. When they hung up, he sat at his desk for a while and thought about the fact that this ordinary 20-minute phone call about a baby and a cottage and a fair-minded landlady was a thing he had, That it existed now, where before there had been 5 weeks of silence and a $3 million investigation and a letter he had memorized. That the path between those 2 points had required everything it had required. He thought it was worth it. He thought that was almost certainly too simple a way to put it, and that the full accounting was more complicated and would take years to complete. But sitting at his desk in Chicago on a January evening, he thought, this specific thing, being allowed to call and hear that his son was loud and annoyingly smart, was worth what it had cost. Vanessa Hale left Chicago in February. He heard about it from Sandra, who heard about it through the network of professional adjacency that operated in the background of their industry like a secondary circulatory system. Vanessa had taken a position with a consulting firm in San Francisco. A good firm, a good role, a move that read on paper as a deliberate step forward, and which probably was, at least professionally. He didn't hear about it from Vanessa herself. She didn't call, didn't send a note, didn't manage the ending the way she had managed everything else. She just went. He thought about her occasionally in the months that followed. Not with guilt exactly, but with the particular discomfort of someone who has looked honestly at their own role in a situation and found it less clean than they would prefer. He had not made her who she had been in that cottage doorway in Maine, but he had created a context in which who she had been in that doorway had seemed like a rational option. That was not nothing, and he did not try to make it nothing. He hoped she was doing well in San Francisco. He thought she probably was. Vanessa Hale was not a woman who stayed down. The formal divorce was finalized in March. It was quiet, which was the right word for it, a legal process that resolved without drama because the terms had already been agreed to and both parties had already, in their different ways, accepted what was true. Damien signed the final documents on a Tuesday afternoon in Preston's office, in a room with a view of the Chicago River going gray and swollen with snowmelt, and felt nothing dramatic, just the clean finality of a thing concluded. Preston, to his credit, said nothing procedural. He just capped his pen and said, "You handled this well. Eventually." "Eventually," Damien agreed. "You know your equity situation is going to draw questions at the next shareholder meeting." "I know." "What do you want me to tell them?" Damien thought about it for a moment. "Tell them I made a correction, that I had equity in the company held under terms that didn't accurately reflect the contributions that earned it, and I corrected it. And if anyone wants to argue with that assessment, they're welcome to review the company's founding period financials and explain to me where they think the discrepancy is." Preston looked at him for a moment. "That's actually a good answer." "It's also true," Damien said. "Which helps." The shareholder meeting in April went better than his board had feared. The equity restoration drew 2 questions, both of which Damien answered with the directness of someone who had run out of patience for managed narratives. One institutional investor pushed back mildly on the optics. Damien told him with precise and even courtesy that he wasn't interested in the optics, that it was the right thing, and he had done it, and if the investor's concern was the company's financial health, he could direct his attention to the Q1 numbers, which were the strongest in 3 years. Marcus Webb caught him in the hallway afterward and said, "You've changed." "I'm working on it," Damien said. "No," Marcus said. "I mean, you've actually changed. That's different from working on it." Damien considered that on the drive home. He flew to Maine in April for his first scheduled visit. The cottage looked different in spring. The marsh had come back to life, gone from the gray-brown of December to a particular vivid green that had no equivalent in Chicago, the kind of color that arrives after a long winter and reminds you that absence is not the same as gone. There were birds in the woodline that had not been there in December, making the considerable racket of creatures who have returned somewhere they belong. Claire met him at the door. She looked. He noticed immediately and filed it as a fact rather than a wound, like herself. Not the managed version of herself that had existed in the penthouse, where she had been perpetually slightly braced, slightly careful, navigating the atmosphere of a space that had never fully been hers. Just herself. Her hair was longer. She was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and her feet were bare on the porch boards, and she looked like a person who had arrived somewhere and was no longer making an argument for being there. Ethan was in her arms, 4 months old, His face had resolved from the red, scrunched newborn face into something with actual character. Wide eyes that moved between Damien and Claire with the absorbed attention of someone cataloging the world. A small, serious mouth. His mother's forehead, after all, despite what Claire had said in the hospital room. He had a little more hair than Damien expected. He was wearing a blue onesie with a whale on it, which seemed appropriate for coastal Maine, and also struck Damien as the best garment he had ever seen. "Hi," Claire said. "Hi," Damien said. She handed him Ethan without preamble. "He just ate, so don't jiggle him." He took his son. Ethan looked at him, the same long, serious look he gave to everything, the look of a person doing genuine assessment, and then made a sound that was not a word but had the quality of a position being stated. "He's opinionated," Damien said. "He really is," Claire said, already heading back inside. "Coffee? Please." He stood on the porch with Ethan in his arms and looked out at the marsh, at the green of it coming back, at the water catching the April light. Ethan reached up and grabbed his collar with one hand and held on with the focused determination of someone who has recently discovered that hands are for holding things. Damien covered Ethan's hand with his own. The visit was 3 days. They did not talk about the past, not in any extended, deliberate way. It had been talked about. The talking was done. What they did instead was move through the ordinary business of a baby's days. The morning feeding, the walk into town that Ethan seemed to enjoy based on the fact that he stopped making declarative sounds and started looking at everything with the wide, consuming attention of someone taking inventory. The afternoon quiet when he slept, and Claire worked at the kitchen table on the landscape design projects she had picked up through a small firm in Rockland. He helped where he could. He was not skilled at this. He had no practice, no inherited ease, and he made mistakes that were small and ordinary and human. He put Ethan in the carrier backward the first time, which Ethan found deeply objectionable. He misread a tired cry as a hungry one, and then a hungry one as a tired one. He moved too fast in the kitchen and startled Ethan out of a half-sleep and spent 20 minutes learning, with Claire's patient and not entirely unsympathetic instruction, how to move slowly in a room that contained a baby who was on the edge of napping. "You're treating him like a boardroom problem," Claire said, not unkindly on the second evening, "like something you can optimize." "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." "With him you don't optimize," she said. "You just be there. That's the whole job." He sat with that for the rest of the evening. It was the same instruction she had been trying to give him in different form for 4 years. "We're just walking." And then in the letter, the air inside that apartment. "And now, you just be there." He had needed to hear it 3 times in 3 different registers before it started to land somewhere actionable. On the last evening, after Ethan was down for the night, they sat on the porch with coffee. The marsh was doing something extraordinary in the late light, going amber at the edges, the water holding the color of the sky. There was a bird somewhere that had one particular call it repeated with great confidence and no apparent self-consciousness. The air was cold enough to need a jacket, but not cold enough to go inside. "I want to ask you something," Damien said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not managerially." She looked at him. "When have I ever answered managerially?" "Fair point. Ask." He looked at the marsh. "Are you okay? Not the baby, not the cottage, not the terms. You. Are you okay?" She was quiet for a moment. A real pause, the kind where someone is checking in with themselves rather than assembling an answer. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am, more than I've been in a long time." She paused again. "There are days when I'm tired and I'm alone and I miss having someone around, not you specifically, just the idea of someone. But it's an honest missing. It doesn't have fear in it." She looked at her coffee. "When I was in the penthouse, everything had fear in it. I didn't even know it until I left." He absorbed that. "I did that," he said, "not as self-flagellation, just as a fact that deserved to be named directly." "You contributed to it," she said. "I'm not entirely without responsibility. I stayed longer than I should have. I kept making excuses that cost me." She glanced at him. "We both had our part." "Mine was larger," he said. She didn't argue with that. "Yes," she said. "It was." They sat in the quiet for a while. The bird made its call. The marsh held its light. "He's going to want to know about you," Claire said, "when he's old enough to ask. Who you are, what you do, what happened between us." "I know." "What do you want him to know?" He thought about it seriously, the way it deserved. "I want him to know I was wrong about things that mattered, and I worked to fix them. I want him to know that his mother is someone he should watch and learn from, because she knows things about how to be a person that took me 44 years to start figuring out." He paused. "And I want him to know that I love him, not as an achievement or a legacy or anything like that. Just, I love him. That's the whole sentence." Claire looked at him for a long time. "Okay," she said. It was what she had said in the hospital room. "I hear you." And here it was again. Okay. Small words carrying real weight, the way small words do when the person saying them is choosing them honestly. It was not absolution. It was not the declaration that everything had been repaired, because everything had not been repaired. Because some things do not repair. They just become part of the shape of a life. Scar tissue that was once a wound and is now simply the way you are. But it was something. It was the specific, real something of two people who had hurt each other and been hurt, and had, against the considerable odds of their own worst instincts, arrived at a morning after. Not together, not in the way the word together usually means, but in the same direction. Pointed toward the same small person in the room down the hall, who had no idea yet what any of it had cost, and who was, despite all of it, perfectly fine. He drove back to Portland the next morning. He had a flight at noon. He stood at the car for a moment before getting in. Claire was at the door with Ethan. She had him in the carrier now. The right way, facing out the way Ethan preferred, which Damien now knew. And Ethan was doing his thing of looking at everything with complete seriousness, cataloging the world. "I'll call Thursday," Damien said. "We'll be here," she said. He got in the car. He backed down the gravel drive and turned onto the marsh road. In the rear-view mirror, the cottage shrank. The porch, the smoke from the chimney, Claire and Ethan standing in the door, getting smaller, and then the trees came between them and they were gone. He drove. The coast road in April was different from the coast road in December. The trees were not bare, or not all of them, and the ocean when it came into view was a different color, something between green and blue, with real light in it instead of the flat gray of winter. He drove with the window down again, the same as the first time, and the smell of salt and spring was in the car all the way to Portland. He thought about the visit. He thought about Ethan's hand on his collar, and the backward carrier, and the 20 minutes learning to move slowly, and the evening on the porch when Claire had said, "You just be there." He thought about the letter, which he no longer needed to take out and read because it was simply part of him now, lodged somewhere below the place where strategic thinking happened, in whatever part of a person holds the things that actually changed them. He thought about what it had cost to get here. The money was the smallest part. The money was nothing. It was just numbers. The real cost was harder to put in a column. 4 years of a marriage that had deserved better. A woman he had loved imperfectly and driven away and found and let go of. A version of himself that had run an empire on the fuel of control and called it capability. The cost of understanding something too late is that you cannot go back and apply the understanding. You can only carry it forward. That is the tax on being a slow learner about the things that matter most. He had been a very slow learner, but he was learning. 3 years later, a profile of Damien Ashford ran in a business publication, the kind of measured, semi-admiring piece that gets written about people who have rebuilt something after a public fall. It noted the company's strongest revenue period in its history. It noted the equity restoration to Claire Bennett, framed as an unusual voluntary correction that had drawn both criticism and quiet respect from different quarters of the industry. It noted that Ashford was described by his team as more present, more direct, and, this was the word two different sources used independently, human in a way that had not previously characterized his leadership. The journalist asked him, near the end of the interview, what had changed. He thought about all the ways to answer that. The polished version, the strategically humble version, the version that served the narrative of the piece. He said, "I had a son." and I had to figure out who I actually was before I could be someone he deserved to have around. The journalist wrote it down. That's it, she said. That's the important part, he said. He drove home from the interview to an apartment he had moved to 2 years ago, smaller than the penthouse, a different neighborhood, a place he had chosen because he liked the street and not because it projected anything in particular. He had sold the penthouse. That had felt right in a way he hadn't fully predicted. He made dinner. He called Ethan at 7, which was their standing Thursday call. Ethan was 3 now, which meant the conversations were largely conducted on Ethan's terms and covered the subjects Ethan found pressing. The specific colors of dump trucks, a dog named Biscuit who lived 2 houses down from the cottage, and a board book about a caterpillar that Ethan considered the foundational text of Western literature. Claire was in the background doing the dinner dishes, occasionally contributing a clarifying note when Ethan's narration became too abstract. Biscuit found a thing, Ethan said. What kind of thing? Damien asked. A dead thing. Oh, was it interesting? Very interesting. Mama said no. Sounds right. Daddy? Yeah. When are you coming? 3 weeks, Damien said. Then we're going to the beach, remember? With the rocks? With the rocks. Okay, Ethan said, with the completeness of someone who has received the information he needed and considers the matter resolved. Damien stayed on the call for another 20 minutes, listening to Ethan describe Biscuit's entire character in considerable detail, and the properties of various dump truck colors, and the plot of the Caterpillar book, which Ethan narrated with the intensity of someone recounting actual news. Claire laughed at something in the background. The same laugh she had at the grocery in Harwick, the one Dennis Farrow had reported back, the one that had made Damien feel, even then, that she was already somewhere beyond his ability to reach. He was not trying to reach her anymore. He was just listening. That was the whole job. You just be there. When they hung up, he sat in his kitchen for a while without doing anything in particular. He thought about the morning in the hospital room and Ethan's hand in the gray Maine light. He thought about the drive back along the coast, the first time and every time since, the way the smell of the ocean stayed in the car all the way to Portland. He thought about what it meant to build something and lose yourself inside it, to put so much weight into the architecture of achievement that the person who was supposed to live inside it stopped being real. He had done that. He had done it with his company and with his marriage, and with almost every relationship he had maintained for the first 4 decades of his life. He had built impressive things and inhabited none of them. There is a kind of success that is really just a very elaborate form of avoidance. You build, and you build, and you put distance between yourself and anything that requires you to simply be present, because presence is the one thing you cannot control and cannot optimize and cannot negotiate your way through. You can only arrive at it. And arriving at it usually requires losing something first. It requires the particular education of losing something you cannot buy back. He had lost things he could not buy back. He knew that clearly now, without drama, without the consuming grief of the first weeks after the penthouse went quiet. Just as a fact about his life, one of the defining facts, the kind that shapes the shape of a person. He had been wrong about what mattered for a long time. He had hurt people in his wrongness, and then, at a cost he had not controlled or predicted or chosen, he had been given the chance to learn differently. What he had learned was not complicated. It did not require a $4 billion company to understand, or a $3 million investigation, or a letter that a better version of himself would have understood the first time. What he had learned was what Claire had tried to teach him on a cold Saturday by a lake, years before any of this. Before the letter and the cottage and the hospital room and the porch in April with the marsh going amber in the late light. We're just walking. That was it. That was the whole thing. Some days are just days. Some moments don't need to be managed. Some people in your life are not problems to be solved or positions to be understood or variables in the broader equation of what you are trying to become. Some people are just people, living their lives alongside you, waiting to see if you'll put down the agenda long enough to actually be there. He had put it down, not all at once, not perfectly, not without the considerable wreckage of everything that had to break before he understood what he was holding. But he had put it down. 3 weeks from now, he would drive up the marsh road and park on the gravel, and Ethan would come running out because Ethan ran everywhere now with the total physical commitment of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to hedge. And he would pick his son up, and they would go look at rocks on the beach and talk about dump trucks and Biscuit and the caterpillar. And it would be an ordinary day, unremarkable by any external measure, the kind of day that does not make the business press. It would be the most important thing he did that week. He was sure of that in a way he had not been sure of anything in a long time. Not the clean, controlled certainty of a man who has run the numbers, but the quieter, messier, more durable certainty of a man who has finally learned to tell the difference between what he is performing and what is real. He got up and washed his dishes. He turned off the kitchen light. Outside, Chicago went about its business in the dark, enormous and indifferent and full of lives being lived by people who would never know his name and who were, in their own particular ways, trying to figure out the same things he was. He went to bed. He slept.